This is Kathy from Gadget Stop 321, and in today's video I'm taking a look at Sailor Ink Studio 280. And when I first tried this ink, I didn't know how I was going to describe the color. When you use it on a paper like Tomoe River or even in my Leuchtturm notebook, it has a multicolored shading that I didn't really know how I was going to describe what color this was. And the paper towel that I use to wipe off my pen, you can kind of see it's almost like a mauve base color with some lime green. But I found in my writing samples that if you write on more absorbent paper, it's generally going to be like an olive green. And so I'll show you that in the writing samples that I did on other papers. But on Tomoe River, I'm going to test this ink in a variety of pens and nib sizes ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub nib. And I'm going to start with my Pilot 78G Plus with a stainless steel extra fine nib. Okay. I can tell this isn't real pleasant. It's not really scratchy, but it is very feedbacky. And even the legibility of it, it's kind of a lighter ink and it maintains that fine line. It doesn't spread out any. So I'm just going to label this not scratchy. It's not pleasant, but in a pinch, it's usable. Next, I've got my Quebeco Sport with an extra fine nib. Now, there's a significant difference between these two extra fines. Now, this is pretty pleasant, but I can feel it getting drier as I write, and that has been my past experience with this pen. This was the first fountain pen that I bought for myself, and I used this a lot for journaling. And if I'm journaling like an A5 size page on a Hobonichi Techo or something like that, it'll start out writing, you know, really wet, a nice amount of wetness, and the farther you go down the page, the drier it gets. And I can kind of tell it's going to do this. It does this with every ink. So for lengthy bits of writing, this isn't the best, but for an A6 size page, it was nice. And this is putting down enough ink that I'm starting to see that multicolored shading. Next, I've got a Twisby Mini. This also has a fine nib that writes similar to this extra fine nib, but it's a little bit drier, and you can see from that little swatch. This was one of my earliest fountain pens, and I didn't realize what a dry writer it was relative to other fountain pens because I didn't have that much to compare it to. And I think this is interesting, the little ink smears. The X is one color and the smeared ink is the lime green. The X is like that mauve color. I'm going to say that this is a little dry. It's usable, but it feels a little dry. If you write very fast, it would, I think, be even worse. I'm somewhat of a slow writer. Next, I've got a Lamy Studio with a fine stainless steel nib. This is also a dry writer. It's nice and smooth, but it's just dry. It's not putting down quite enough ink that I don't think we'll see the shading. Yeah, this is even drier than the Twisby. I've got a lot of pens here in the lineup that write dry, but I wanted to represent a variety of brands. Next I have a Sailor LeCool with a medium fine nib. Usually Tomoe River paper will make a nib feel smoother because it's such a smooth paper, but with this pen it tends to be the opposite. This pen feels smoother on like copy paper and poorer quality paper. It tends to be more pleasant. But it also depends on the ink as well. It's a finer, you get some feedback from it being finer than these two or these three previous nibs. I'm going to say that it's okay. It's writing a little bit wetter than those, but just because it's a finer nib, gives it a little more feedback. Next, I've got my Pilot Stargazer, which is a pretty wet writing medium nib. And it is really smooth. And I find that on these tight grids of the Hobonichi, this tends to be almost a little too wet. I think I would prefer a wider ruling for this nib. But it is very smooth. Next, I've got a Platinum 3776 with a medium nib. And you'll see, yeah, it's a little bit drier. And it's a little better suited for these grids. And it's not as wet as the Stargazer. The Stargazer tends to be a little more splotchy, especially when you're trying to write this small. The Platinum medium writes a little more uniformly, and with this ink that has this type of shading, I just feel like it looks better. Next, I've got my Pilot Metropolitan with a cursive medium nib. This is a pretty dry writer, so I don't have high hopes for it. It doesn't feel dry, but I feel like it feels like the ink is having trouble grabbing the page. It's just, look, it's just as wet as the Platinum, but it's putting down a wider line than the Platinum. It looks good. It just didn't feel that great. I felt like I had to write slower to give it a chance to, the ink a chance to grab onto the page. And finally, I've got my Jinhao X750 with a 1.5 stub nib. And I'm feeling like I have to write slower with this one too for it to grab the page. Not as bad since it's a little bit wetter. Okay, I'm going to go ahead. I've been doing it off camera after the writing sample, putting my little tweezer swatch of ink, but I'm going to go ahead and do it here. Just pinch the tines together. Well, dip it in the ink. You get a little bit between the two tines. Okay. And I'm going to give that a chance to dry. And you can see here, usually I don't have to open up the tines to let the ink out the rest of the way, but just like with some of the nibs up here, it had a little trouble grabbing onto the paper. So right here I had to open up the tines and let some of the ink fall out onto the page. You can kind of, when you do these tweezer ink swatches, you can get a feel for some of the qualities of the ink, like its saturation and its, you can get a feel for the ink saturation and viscosity. Okay, so that's Tomoe River paper. This is Rhodia, and you can see here that it's pretty much uniformly olive green. If you look really closely, you might be able to see a little bit of shading, but you would have to know to look for it. Just reading it off the page, it looks like monochromatic olive green. You can see some of them felt kind of dry, and the extra fine felt scratchy. I guess my favorite was the Pilot Stargazer. These grids are a little bit taller, so it gave me a little bit more room for that wet nib. And the platinum was nice also. On 20-pound copy paper, a lot of the inks a lot of the nibs either felt too wet or too dry. Some of them were just okay. Surprisingly, the Pilot Metropolitan felt really nice, and the platinum, with it being a little bit drier than the Stargazer, it felt nice. And the Quebeco Sport did okay, but I'm afraid that if you did much writing at all, it would start feeling dry. And the wetter nibs, the wider nibs, tended to bleed through a little bit. Let's see. Yeah, the cursive medium didn't bleed through too bad, and it felt nice on the page. It does, that cursive medium a lot of times does do pretty good on copy paper. And some of the finer nibs that were less pleasant didn't bleed through too bad. All right. On my Leuchtturm, you can start to see some multicolored shading. My light here, it may not be showing up as well, but you can see that in the darker spots, you can see that mauve color kind of in the middle. This is an ink that has a similar feel to it to Roaring Klinger Alt Goldgrün, but it had a little more brightness to it. That mauve in this one, I guess, makes it feel a little darker. I don't know. It's an interesting ink. It has some interesting properties, and you can see on this swatch, we got two in the heavy spots. You've got that mauve colored, and it's surrounded by a kind of a darker green. I guess for good quality paper, I do like the Stargazer, but only if I'm going to be writing a little bit bigger. Even on really the platinum, I kind of like the way it looks. You can see the shading. It gives the letters some dimension. The letters look like they're mauve surrounded by the green. It's interesting. I don't know if I would like it as an everyday writer because it tends to run a little dry in a lot of my pens, but I guess the Platinum 3776 tended to do well across all the paper styles. All right, if you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.